In this video, you're about to watch a rare generational game between Mikhail Tal and Bobby Fischer. Prior to this game, they faced each other 10 times with a scoreline of 4-2 in Tal's favor. However, this game was part of the 1963 World Championship cycle. That's why both the players were playing with unbelievable precision until one of them slipped up with a heavy mistake and ended up handing the winning position to the other player, until tragedy struck. But before we check out the game, I have something for you. Real quick, I know you're tired of being stuck at chess. That's why you must check out Chess AIX. Chess AIX allows you to conduct analysis with the strongest engine, as well as gives you improvement stats and details with personalized training plan. Use code WIN30 to get 30% off as a limited time offer. Now let's get back to the video. Tal is playing as white here. He starts off the game with pawn to e4. Fischer replies with c5 to Sicilian, knight f3, d6, g4. The game transposes into the Sicilian Najdorf variation after pawn to a6. The Najdorf is a very poor choice of an opening if you're considering to play this in 2026, just because of the reason that white has too many options. White could choose the main line with bishop to g5, or throw weirder options like rook to g1 or pawn to h3. And you must be ready to face everything, which is extremely difficult to prepare against. That's why it must be avoided. Anyways, Tal plays bishop to e2. A fairly standard move against the Najdorf. We have pawn to e5 kicks the knight back to b3. Black continues with bishop to e6. We have castles, knight b to d7. Tal expands on the queen side with pawn to a4. Bishop to e7. Fischer prepares to castle on his own. And here Tal knows that both players are extremely well prepared. So if he wants to beat Fischer and grab the win, he needs to create positional imbalance. And starting this, he plays pawn to f4. It kind of weakens the e4 pawn, but it's quite necessary because the rook will be opening up and there are certain possibilities of going for an attack against the black king. Fischer continues with queen to c7, developing the queen. We have bishop to e3, castles. White decides to grab more space on the queen side by playing pawn to a5, and here Tal is setting up a very deadly trap. He wants to play knight to a4 to knight to b6, and if this knight or bishop manages to land on b6, it will be very devastating for Fischer, and Fischer needs to prevent this, so he plays pawn to b5, trying to prevent it. We have a captures en passant, knight captures, and pawn to f5. Very important to lock the position whenever you're attacking or you're going for an attack. Fischer plays bishop to c4, offering to trade bishops. We have bishop captures, queen captures on b6 with check, the king needs to move, and Fischer plays bishop to b5. And here white decides to make a weird decision. Tal decides to capture with the bishop by playing bishop captures on b5. It's interesting why he did not choose with the knight, because generally any player would choose that. But we have bishop captures, a captures, and knight to d5. Had this knight not been on f6, it would be a monstrous knight, but since it is there, now comes knight captures. Queen captures, attacking the rook twice on a8, so the rook needs to move. And here Fischer plays a clever move. He plays rook to a4, enticing Tal to decide to take on a4. But if Tal decides to take on a4, then after b captures, white is sort of in a doom state. The knight needs to move away, and queen captures on b2 is coming, and with the passed a pawn, Fischer will be clearly winning. So after rook to a4, pawn to c3 was played, preventing any threats of rook to d4. And now comes queen to a6, forcing pressure. We have rook to d1. Till this point, both the players were extremely accurate. So when both players are perfect, one decides to be crazy, and Tal exactly does that. He decides to let his inner magician take over too much and makes a mistake by playing knight to c1. This gives Fischer the opportunity to take advantage of this mistake, and he finds it. Pawn to b4, the winning move in every position. And the problem for Tal is that he needs to be pretty precise here. C takes on b4, the obvious continuation leads to rook captures, the b2 pawn is hanging, and a normal defensive move like knight to d3 proves to be a blunder because of rook to b5. And believe it or not, the white queen is just trapped. There is no way to save it. White has to give up the knight and will be down a piece. So after pawn to b4, instead of playing precisely, Tal decides to make another mistake. He plays knight to d3. This just drops the pawn on c3. Fischer takes, b takes, and surprisingly Fischer does not decide to take on c3. After rook captures on c3, the move I suppose that Fischer was afraid of was knight captures on e5. And after d captures, queen captures, there is an attack on both the bishop and the rook. However, Fischer probably missed the move bishop to b4. This is the only defensive move. Queen to b8 and queen to e8, both of these options fails the bishop back to f8. But unfortunately, Fischer missed it. Rather, Fischer decides to counterattack the queen by playing rook to a5. This gives Tal the much needed sigh of relief. Tal drops the queen back to b3. We have rook to a3, indirectly attacking the c3 pawn. However, things are much more different now. Queen b1, Fischer wins the pawn. Knight to b4, placing the knight on a square which comes with a tempo. Queen to a7, and Tal manages to land the knight on d5. And this is probably what Fischer feared. An unopposed knight on d5 is the strongest piece. No matter how many pawns you're down, you could be even down a queen, but if it's unopposed, you can't do shit about it. Anyways, Fischer decides to save the rook by playing rook to c6, queen to b3. The bishop is saved, even if it was not really attacked. We have pawn to h3. Tal creates some breathing room for the king. We have rook a6, rook to b1, rook to a3, gaining some tempo on the queen. The queen moves to b5, and Fischer centralizes the queen by playing queen to d4 and also attacks on the pawn on e4. So rook to e1 defending by white, and Fischer now really puts on the pressure by playing rook to g3. We have queen back to e2, getting onto the defense. Queen to d3 offers to trade queens, which leads to an equal position, declines the queen trade. We have queen to c2, threatening checkmate on g2. And now rook to g1 here would be a big mistake because of queen captures on e4, and Tal will be dropping a piece and will be completely losing. So after queen to c2, queen to e2 was played. This forces a trade of queens. We have queen captures, rook captures, and pawn to h5. Fischer himself creates some breathing room for his king. White plays rook to a2, decides to activate both of his rooks. Rook to d3, rook a7. Very nice of Tal, deciding to control the 7th rank. We have pawn to h4, Fischer expands on the king's side. Pawn to f6, trying to break in. g6, king to h2. And now comes a very beneficial lesson from Bobby Fischer. Here Fischer knows that he could control the dark squares if the knight is eliminated. So that's exactly what he does. He plays rook captures on d5, eliminating the strong knight for the exchange sacrifice. E takes on d5 was played. Fischer now manages to activate the bishop on the long diagonal by playing bishop to h6, controlling more key squares. We have rook to e7. You might argue, why then Tal play rook b to b7 and try to gain control over the entire 7th rank with both of his rooks? Well, the problem was due to his own back rank issues after bishop to f4 check. If the king goes to the back rank, then rook to c1 is a big checkmating threat that Tal needs to avoid. So the only proper defense after bishop to f4 is pawn to g3, but then comes h captures on g3. And as white, not only you're down 2 pawns, but you also have to fight to survive against the passed g pawn, which is extremely difficult to hold. White decided to prolong with the option of rook to e7. We have bishop to g5, putting pressure on the f6 pawn. We have rook to f1 defending, and now comes bishop to f4 check. The king moves to g1 and g5. Fischer manages to complete the pawn chain, which means it will be very difficult for Tal to break through. Tal plays rook to b1. He wants to double down on the 7th rank by playing rook b to b7 again. Fischer now showcases his deep positional understanding by sacrificing the e-pawn by playing pawn to e4, as he feels that losing the e-pawn will be much better than losing the f-pawn. That's because Tal's initial plan rook b to b7 now cannot be undermined because rook to c1 check comes in, and after king to f2, Tal just runs into a perpetual with rook to c2 check. And he cannot avoid this, the game ends in a draw. So Tal does not want to have that happen. So after pawn to e4, Tal decides to play rook captures on e4. This gives Fischer to activate his king by playing king to h7. We have rook to e7, again targeting the f-pawn, but now king to g6. We have rook b to b7, Fischer wins a pawn, Tal does the same. Now comes king to e5. The bishop on f4 is just the star piece. It does not allow the white king to come out, as well as does not allow white to capture anything. So we have rook to c7 offering to trade. Fischer declines. Rook to b1. The game is just heading towards a draw now. We have rook to c2. Rook a3. King to f2 activating the king. Rook b3. Rook e to check. King to f5. It was in this position that both players decided to agree to a draw. So there you have it. A near perfect performance for both the players. What do you think? Let me know.